Moving forward, we would now like to proceed with the final panel of the day, Human Learning Systems as an Approach for Improved Public Service Experience. The panel will bring their experiences, multiple perspectives, and current understanding of the overarching process of change, how to purposefully plan and enact the kind of learning-based emergent change that a shift towards human learning systems represents. Additionally, the panel will also discuss the scope of HLS in the Indian context, possible approaches enabling learning from local to national public management practice, and drawing implications for policy decision-making at the local, national, and global level, focusing on generating new visions for government and public policy development. For the same, I would now like to request our esteemed panelists to come up to the dais. We would now request Professor Naresh Singh, Vice Dean, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, P Jindal Global University, Professor R Sudarshan, Dean, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, P Jindal Global University, Ms. Smita Jha, Director, Center for Public Impact, India, Ms. Sumalatha K C, Trainee, GIZ Chennai, to come up to the stage.
To see all of you on the third day of this dialogue. It gives me an immense pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel with my esteemed colleagues. What is interesting for me in this kind of setting is two real things. One is that you see on the board. One is that we are having a dialogue about public policy issues, and our focus is going to be largely on that delivery end, where public policy gets implemented so that citizens' lives can be better. But also it is about bridging research and practice. And that is why at the university, in a university context where we do research, our research as a School of Government and Public Policy needs to be bridged and work with practitioners. And that is how we are going to anchor this. What we are going to talk about is a set of ideas that we are just beginning to explore. Unlike many other panels that you would have listened to, many other conversations you would have listened to, where we have discussed existing challenges, whether it be cybersecurity or whether it be a range of other issues that we have talked about over the last 3 days, while we are addressing well-known problems in this panel, the proposed approach that we are discussing is relatively new, 3-4 years old maybe, in practices from different countries, and the ideas have not yet been tested in any significant way. We have just, in a very preliminary way, have started to think this through. The way we will do this is that I will frame the issue as I see it, and then I will turn to my colleagues here on the panel for some opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion both among ourselves, but I'd really like to engage with you, the audience, as well. So what we are going to be talking about is really what I would summarize as citizen-centric or citizen-focused public service. And why is it that I want to talk about that? Is I have come to the conclusion after 30 years of work in various aspects of public policy in about 50 countries around the world, that our democracies don't deliver to people what they want or what they were promised at elections time. So at the most fundamental level then, public policy needs to be challenged, and we are not talking in any significant way about how that public policy delivers at the grassroots level. We have made, I think you will agree with me, that we have made our citizens into consumers, into clients, into customers, if you are in the private sector. And on occasion, we have improved a little bit and made them into shareholders and stakeholders. But their real agency as citizens, who should be in charge, are not. In fact, the public servant tends to be in charge of public service, and one needs to challenge that. So in order for us to have a meaningful conversation from this rather complex subject, I'll just put on a few posters, a few pointers to guide our conversation as we go forward. So the first pointer is that I'm posing, and I'd like you also to note your questions and to come in after we have had some opening statements, is how would we know to what extent citizens' needs are being met? And I would argue that in order to do this, and to do it well, averages of to what extent particular health or education or sanitation or water, to what extent coverage has been achieved, is not a good measure of the way citizens are actually experiencing satisfactory public service. So that's the first one. And the reason is that each citizen has equal rights, that we know. But each citizen experiences public services differently depending on their own situation. A disabled citizen does not experience health care the same way as someone who is able-bodied, and so on and so on. So the variety of experiences is as many as the variety of individuals that we have. Right now, public service delivery or management is focused, I would argue, on the public servant. The way we measure success is by measuring performance objectives, largely determined by the public servants. And what makes matters even worse is that they set up measures that they call outputs and outcomes in terms of citizen satisfaction, but they are really measuring what they can measure, and they are really measuring their own performance. So that does not work well for obvious reasons, right? So we need to shift. So the situation then, when you look at a citizen, you find a citizen in a household. That household is in a community. That community is in a district, which is in a state, which is in the country, and globally, if you like. So we have a nested set of levels, which one might call a system. So in this kind of system where you have many, many relationships and feedback loops, one might say, this system is what in technical terms we call a complex adaptive system. It is changing, it is evolving, it's adapting all the time. Here, rules and standard operating procedures, which are typical of public service management, rules don't work well. So how are we to do things differently in this kind of context? Well, I will suggest that what I have just been saying to you is that you need a situation in which public servants are not the babus we make them out to be, that they have all power and that they have all knowledge. They need to be learning and adapting to the challenges we face in different contexts and different citizens. So we are suggesting then that learning and adaptive capacity should be the management strategy of public service. Let me summarize what I've just said to you. Humans are varied in their needs and their experience of public service. They live in systems, not as isolated beings. So we have humans, we have systems, and we are arguing that public servants need, and all stakeholders need to be active and work in a learning approach. And when you bring these together, we get humans, learning, and we get systems. And we just come up with a little phrase called human learning systems. Right? That's all it means. It's not some, I wouldn't call it some new jargon. I think it's organic. It's coming from what we are observing. Now there's some experience around the world, and other of my colleagues will hopefully reflect on what HLS experience has been elsewhere. We have a little experience already in India. We will share a little bit about that as well. So in the agenda we are discussing and setting then, the frame that we are setting, the research frame, and the way to bridge research and practice is that we are going to be looking at carrying out some further research on how this might be done in the different contexts that we face here. so that we can find a way in which academics and research work can really interact with practitioners on the front lines, and so that over time we will have this learning approach which will improve public service and hopefully help to put the citizen at the center of public service, which is the ideal we have always hoped for. But in addition, we might also address how governments behave. You know, there's a lot of talk, I hear a lot of talk about what they call it minimum government, maximum governance, right? We hear a lot about that. But some people are becoming quite cynical, and they're saying, maybe this is becoming minimum government, maximum markets. I don't know where you stand on all of this, or whether it should be minimum government at all, or should it be effective government and effective governance. So all of that, you know, one needs to question. So there is now very interesting emerging work on how governments should be, not only what governments do. And when we talk about how governments should be, we are talking about what are the underlying beliefs, values, and principles that drive government action. And I am taking these words from Adrian Brown, who works for the Center for Public Impact globally, and we have Smita Jha with us, who will reflect a little bit maybe on what CPI does, since we have a chapter of CPI here as well. Let me wrap this up then and turn to my colleagues now. But because not everybody here and not on the panel, I know for sure, has heard the gems of wisdom that have come from the last 2 days, let me just share a little bit of what I heard coming from the observations from the dialogue. One is that, now I'm talking about India. So while I've spent these last 3 decades working globally, the last 2 years I've been focused on India, and I've learned a lot over the last 2 days in this dialogue. One, people do not demand public service, and so the provider abdicates. And when the provider abdicates, the people no longer go for the service. And so we are getting a vicious downward cycle. The example given was when the doctor doesn't show up, people lose confidence, they don't bother to go. When they don't show up, the doctor stays away even more. And so it goes down until you lose the service. The other thing is a nice evolution of how public service has been in our country, in India. Patron-client started out in the 50s to the 70s, then user fees versus public goods debate. All of this has been happening. It's been evolving. Markets and new public management, where you have managers, markets, and metrics dominating the public service. We have had rights-based approach, with the state as duty holder and the citizens as rights holders. All of it has been evolving together. Now we have moved into a phase which was fascinating for me to hear, where they have coming back to what Kennedy said in the 60s, ask what you can do for your country rather than what your country can do for you. And one panelist even expressed the sentiment that job seekers are seen as an anti-national activity. Job seeking. Because when you are job seeking, you're not thinking about what you can do for your country, but if you are job creating, then you are acting in the national interest. Even that came up. So this is the mix of issues in the public service as I heard them. Fascinating stuff has come out. And so I'm going to close with this, just put on the table that people have argued that we need channels to allow citizens to be heard. Nothing new, right? We've always heard that. But can we make that happen? In the new India that is emerging, with the 2047 vision that we have articulated, can we truly give voice to the poor? Can we find a way to apply the principle of subsidiarity, where decisions are made at the lowest feasible level? arguments that cities are rich in this country compared to their proportion of contribution to GDP, but public service in cities are poor. Now I conclude that we now have unique opportunities. Why all of this that has failed, why do I think it can work now? Much of it can work now. Because now we have an India with a level of energy that we have never seen before, I would argue. And if we find strategic ways of piggybacking on the digital revolution, on the startup energy, and all of that, so public service will work hand in hand, then hopefully we will indeed be able to achieve this kind of a citizen-centric public service. So that's my framing of the issues. And I will turn now to Smitha and ask her to share a few thoughts, some opening remarks with us. Smitha, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Naresh, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak with all of you. Introducing myself, I'm Smitha, and I represent Center for Public Impact. We are a BCG foundation which works with a mission of reimagining the government so that it works for everyone. As lofty and as theoretical it can sound, but that's really our hope in terms of why we set up this as a foundation. BCG as a consulting practice, as many of you would know, already works in the social impact space. And of course works in the consulting in terms of advising governments as well as the private sector on various complex issues. But when you look at the complexity in our development sector, especially when it relates to the government and bringing about changes in people's lives, it can't get more complex. And I think throughout the 3 days, and somewhere the organizers should sort of analyze the number of times the word complex has been actually used to actually fundamentally define what the challenge of each of the democracies is there, and more so in the developing economies. So that's our agenda at Center for Public Impact. And so from a vision perspective in terms of how do we actually make it real, our endeavor is to provide a platform where we can support governments directly as well as change makers who are working with governments to be able to be more effective in the program work that they are doing to improve citizens' lives. And so when we come in as CPI, we come in as a learning partner, unlike our consulting avatar of coming with the solution, because this is not an industry, or this is not a sector or an area where you can give out a problem and improve person's life. If that were be so, then we would actually not have a job, and that will be a great thing. But we know that's not a reality. So our efforts to come in as a learning partner is to be able to support the government and change makers to reimagine how public service can be provided, because the ultimate outcome that we are also seeking, which is again quite similar to everyone else, is to improve everyone's lives. So that's really the fundamental of how we got set up. And of course, CPI globally tied up with Professor Naresh in looking at different approaches to public service management. This is not a problem just in India. In fact, we were born in the UK. The Scottish government was the first donor for CPI to be able to fund a different thinking and a different approach of doing public service management, and that's why CPI and Professor Naresh, we partnered together. So that's really how HLS was born, as a sort of a backstory, because fundamentally how public service management actually happens in India and across the world, it was something that was not, we were very bothered with it, and that became a fundamental thing. So it's still an emerging proposition, an emerging approach in terms of how we can do things differently. It's been on, I think, for 4 years now. We've been working on different areas and aspects around that. I think that's really been the fundamental, and we are here committed. But again, there are no solutions, and we'll talk about the latest stage that we are in terms of developing this approach, which is called the Human Learning Systems Guide. Because when we want to make things real, we also want to make sure that people know actually how to go about doing this. And I'll talk about the guide a little bit more after some of the opening comments.
Yeah. Much appreciated, Smitha. Thank you for that intro. I will now ask, we did a small experiment to begin to get our feet wet, our hands dirty, so to speak. And one of our researchers was Sumalatha. So I'll ask Sumalatha to share a little bit from that experience of having actually conducted some small field survey. Sumalatha, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sumalatha, and I'm happy to be a part of this panel discussion on human learning approach system. So our study discusses an alternative paradigm to new public management called human learning system that puts the end user of the public service, that is the public itself, at the center of the public administration process. So the objective of our research is to understand how HLS can be incorporated in the Indian system of public service delivery and management, and what difference it can make to the system. So for this purpose, we interviewed the government officials, civil society organizations, and successfully conducted 30 live interview sessions. So the qualitative data is then analyzed using NVO for further research. So the thing is, like, I involved myself in the interview process, and I have to admit that the interviewing the officials at the both central and state level, it was very interesting, intriguing, and insightful. I call it very intriguing because some of the findings I would like to share here. Certain questionnaires that we framed in the interview, like asking the officials to share their experience where they can meet someone's needs, and other questions like what changes would they suggest to the existing public service delivery system, etc., initiated a positive and open response from the officials, when many officials open-heartedly share their public service delivery experience and the positive outcome it had on the common people. And second, it was to my surprise that majority of the government officials never said that their job is frustrating. Rather, they said that it was challenging because of the inherent structures and hindrances it poses. And thirdly, almost all the government officials believed that there is a mixed response from the public with a positive change in the perspective regarding the public service delivery is because of the digitalization and online solutions, social media exposure. So with regard to the civil society organizations, all interviewers believe that the civil society organization take front seat in providing the rural services, and while the government officials believe that government take the front seat in providing the services in the social sector like health, education, housing, etc. And the experience was insightful for me because in the rural settings, the CSOs can able to do a collaborative and constant learning system was there with the civil society organization. But when it comes to the government officials and in the government structures, the public service servants admit that there is a scope for learning in the system, but it lacks the institutionalization for constant learning. And secondly, almost all the interviewees perceive there is a lacuna in transparency and feedback mechanism and accepted the need for incorporating human approach into the system. And thirdly, many officials reiterated the need of the Indian public service system to be flexible or adaptive to the situation, need for capacity building, and need for mindset change and multi-stakeholder partnership. And from the CSO side, it is interesting to know that 83% of them express unavailability of assistance from the government, which adversely affect trust, accountability, efficiency. Though the interview sample was minimal, the answers by the officials reflected the need for the Indian public delivery system to incorporate change to deal with the complexity of today's environment. So the survey can be seen as a supportive platform for human learning system approach that believes in a supportive management practices and recognizes human freedom and flourishing.
Thanks very much, Sumalatha. So you can see that while there are going to be big challenges ahead of us, there is surprisingly, an interest in looking for change, for reform, and that was pleasantly surprising. I read a book recently, I think written by a retired IAS officer, Raghunathan. The book is entitled, What You Always Wanted to Know About the Indian Administrative Service, But Were Afraid to Ask. And, when it talks about, this guy is retired, so I guess he can really speak his mind openly. We will have a lot of hard work to do to get this system different. And somebody who has tried, and he told me he failed, but I think he might have succeeded in a few little things. Professor Sudarshan is going to share a little bit with us now. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Naresh. This is very interesting. And I'm very happy to be a part of this panel. And I must at the outset declare myself to be an optimist, believing that transformation, important changes people becoming better off are all possible. I'm convinced of that. But I must say that over the years that I worked in the Ford Foundation and in the UNDP, I've seen many of these fads and fashions in development, as also in management. I started working in the Ford Foundation, and I had a colleague, Professor Robert Chambers, who's now has been with the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex for a long time. And Robert at that time was a great votary, an evangelist for rapid rural appraisal, RRA it was called. And we went about investing money, training people in RRA, and you know, how you use goat pellets to count in a field setting, how do you draw transepts, how do you learn from people, what are the challenges that they are facing, how do you start with the assumption that people know what the problems are, and if they were only able to solve them, they could do it themselves, but there are external constraints, all of that. So we went through that, and we trained a lot of people. Then we started something called participatory approaches, participatory...
Rural appraisal.
Yeah,
PRA.
PALM also.
Then participatory research and learning.
Learning methods, PALM. So we had PRA, RRA,
PLA.
PALM, and you know, and we went about training people in this. Now, in all of this, you see, the experience was that people were trained in these methods. Say, you do it this way and you'll get good results. But the important part is that, yes, you did demonstrate some good results with NGOs, but that touched a very small number of people. The important thing is to make a big difference, you have to be able to work with government and make government change the way it works. Now, that's been rather difficult. In fact, I used to tell Robert Chambers that, you know, Robert, what you're saying is already there in the manual that was produced for officers of the Indian Civil Service. Now, remember, there were only about 1,000 people at the most running the British Raj. And they did it extremely well with respect to their vision and objective, which is to extract revenue, which is why the head of the administration in the district is to this day in many places called collector, because he collected revenue. And they achieved that, and the manual says, even now our officers are trained in horse riding in Mussoorie. What for? The ICS manual says you need to know horse riding because many villages are inaccessible, there are no roads, you have to reach there by horse, you have to camp, and you do a study of what are the practices, mores, beliefs, and so on. So as a result of which we got all these district gazetteers that were written by the civil service officers. Now what Robert was saying is no different, except that he called it rapid rural appraisal, but you go there, you do the appraisal. So what's new about it? It was there, right? Now our officers don't do that at all. They don't write a gazetteer, but a colonial power did it. When Napoleon went to Egypt, he sent a whole lot of academics and scholars to understand and study Egypt. You need to know the country you've colonized. You need to know everything about the people in order to be able to achieve your objectives, which is to exploit the colony. Now we had a changeover, we became independent, but we still have not set aside many of the colonial practices, not to speak of the colonial laws. Many of our laws, including the Sedition Act, is 1860, which we still enforce today, to our shame. So there's nothing very much new in all of this, but we continually have to kind of, you know, there is a people want something new, right? There's a kind of a appetite for something that's fashionable. We are now adopting this method, we now have new public management, now we have something else, and so on. But underlying all this really is what we need to develop is an understanding of what is it that we can learn about human beings. We are dealing with human beings, and that is the issue. Now, if you followed the methods of the natural sciences, that's fine. You can plot the orbit of a planet. You can have a theory about what gravitational forces make the planet move in what way. Whatever you write about it, the planet continues to move the way it does. It doesn't get influenced by what you've written about it. The problem with social science is the moment you say anything about human behavior, that itself can be incorporated. It's a science of hermeneutics, and human beings will act in a way that conforms what you expect them to do, or that contradicts what you expect them to do, because they are self-learning, continually adapting people, right? So dealing with human beings is the beginning of the complexity, and therefore we need to be a little more humble about what we can achieve with these methods, fads and fashions. The main difficulty is government. And the main difficulty here in this country, compared to many other countries, is when the UNDP, I joined the UNDP because it produced a human development report that I was very impressed with. It's now gone on for 25 years, and the Human Development Index is not used in the making of our budgets. In the making of budgets internationally, even UNDP's own budget and allocation of grants is done on the basis of per capita income and GDP, not the Human Development Index. So that's how rigid systems are. So we went and said governance is going to be the main theme for UNDP. FAO looks after agriculture, WHO looks after health, ILO looks after labor, UNESCO looks after education and science research, and so on. UNFPA looks after population. We, UNDP, what are we to look after? We now want to look after governance. And I remember the secretary in the foreign ministry to whom we made a presentation, he said, the British used to tell us, you Indians, you could have self-government or good government, but you can't have both. And we made the choice, you see. So we don't want UNDP to come and tell us how to govern this country. So we had to change the name, and public policy somehow was a bit acceptable to it. But this is the mindset. Now we are up against this challenge because all of the instruments that government uses, now we introduce something called social audits for Mahatma Gandhi rural, but it's still a measurement system, it's still an audit system, but it's done in collaboration with CSOs, fine. But the end of it is not really learning. Government doesn't learn anything from social audits. Government uses it for accountability.
So
the purpose of the social audit is some form of accountability at the local level, because there's a hierarchy here. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, if he frames a policy, by definition it has to be good, because he's an intelligent man. The policy fails to achieve its results because the lower order fellows don't do their job properly. This is the mentality. So we need to challenge that, how to make governments learn.
Absolutely.
Right.
I want
and
to come
Smitha
into
has some thoughts on how to make governments learn. So, Smitha?
No, so and that's why I wanted to come in to say that, this is very, very important, because there is no recipe for success. In the private sector, if you want to sort of start up a supply chain strategy or put up a manufacturing plant, there is a recipe of success which has come through experience, and this is how consultants like us have survived for so many years. But in a complex environment in which we operate, where the outcome is actually improving individual's life, your definition of how your life improves is very different from mine. So how does government now come in and actually sort of bring about that change? And that is what the fundamental objective of human learning systems, as we sort of brought in, came about. And saying that, okay, if there is no system or there is no recipe for success, and we've looked at it globally, because this was an initiative not started out of India, but actually outside India. So it's not a problem about India or, this is our governance structure. Then how do we actually go about it? And that's when we said that, okay, if things are very complex and outcomes means very different, your life is very different from mine, which means that there is no recipe, there is no single truth. And if there is no single truth, that's when learning came in as an essential thing, that then we need to learn, and we need to learn continuously. It's not that we learned it once, we know how it works, we will put out a policy and it should work for everyone. But in the last 3 days and every single session, Every single policy draft which has been discussed has been said that it doesn't work for us. This is the fourth draft. People did not ask us. There was no consultation. The consultation was taken and put into the dustbin. The government doesn't do it. But when you actually go and have a closed-door conversation with the governments, what we also realize at CPI is that there's a real need and there's an interest for them to learn. It is about what Professor Naresh was saying, that are there institutional mechanisms for them to learn? Do they have those institutional horses to be able to go out and go into the villages and see what the real problems is? Because a solution often lies with those people themselves as well. It's about going out and sort of talking to them. So when we sort of started looking at this approach and looking at it globally in many countries and different projects, we said, okay, we cannot build out a recipe. There is no way. There's no solution to this. What we can only bring out is perhaps a guide to the public servants to say that if you want to make a change in the work, in the way you want to do public service and bring out policies, these could be some pointers which could help you in coming to that decision. And that's a three-stage process that we came up with. Again, nothing rocket science. We've always been doing it. Any new project that anyone initiates anywhere almost typically follows that, but it's just about putting a framework and a structure to say that first, please go out and do a discovery. And as you said, references to, a very intelligent person, which I will not repeat, but the idea is that, does that person, does that individual, smart, intelligent individual or his department have an institutional capacity to learn and discover what the real problem is based on which the policy is being formulated? That doesn't exist. So I think discovery becomes very, very important. And in that discovery, it's about learning. And one element is about learning, and the second element is about involving the frontline workers who are actually dealing with the citizens directly to bring them into the process of making any public policy initiative. So usually, as you said, while there's a system and a scale of, the state and the district and the national governments, unfortunately, the public policy initiatives are taken by the national government with very little or almost negligible involvement of the frontline worker of the government who is dealing with the citizen on a day-to-day basis. And that is a lack of institutional mechanism for them to bring that learning, because that collector sitting in the district deals with the citizens day in, day out and knows what will work, what will not work. But there is no mechanism for that person to come in to the North Block where the policies are being drafted to say, it will not work. This telecom policy will not work because I have an analog phone and I have no way of knowing who my caller is. So that institutional mechanism is missing in the governments, and it's again, nothing specifically for India, it's across the world, to say how can we actually do that. So as an example of how we started this initiative in Scotland, where it was about providing healthcare services to senior citizens at their homes, the idea was that each senior citizen at their home wanted a different level of service. Their problems were different. Somebody just wanted a conversation. Somebody wanted, medical advice. Now, can the government allow its workers who are going out and providing these services to those senior citizens in their homes have a flexible approach in terms of providing that services? That is what we can sort of bring out. And that, of course, the underlying pinning thing is that trust and accountability. Right. Because can the government trust the frontline workers to be able to be flexible and adapt their healthcare services when they're providing it to the senior citizens? Do they allow them? Do they trust them? And what is the accountability mechanism for them to report back that, yes, they actually, did the work that they were paid for, and they went there, they visited, and there's a satisfaction from that senior citizen that healthcare service was provided to me. So I think, with organizations and governments and, so-called developed markets like Scotland also have the similar challenge. So for us to sit in India, one can sort of, blurt it out to say that, oh, this is so frustrating, this is a challenge in India, it doesn't work in India, nobody understands, no governments don't look at it, but actually it's a phenomenon across the world.
All over.
So from our perspective, the way we are looking at it is a three-stage thing. Like, if there's a mechanism for building discovery of actually, looking at what the real solutions are and institutionalizing that mechanism, that's step number one. The step number two is what we call a sense making, that once you've understood what the problems are, what you want to sort of actually deliver, can you make sense of it? And can you then, third stage is do an action learning, because you need to sort of do something, learn from that activity, come back, revise, change, go back, and that's what we call as adaptive learning, continuous learning process. So this is a broad framework of what we are at after 4 years of research across the world in different projects. There is no recipe for success. There is no standard way of doing public service management. One can keep criticizing that the use of metrics is not good, but there is no alternative system to build in accountability at the government. And to that extent, any of these kind of new approaches perhaps should be taken up, is what our hope is, and that's what we're here for. I thought I'd just share my thing.
No, I want to open up to the audience because I do really want to get some inputs and conversations going. So why don't we turn, yes, please, there's one here and one here to start.
You take the mic.
Do we have someone who can, yes, the mic is coming. So over here first, just raise your hand again, yeah.
My question is to Professor Sudarshan. So, Professor, you talked about, it's not working? So you talked about social audits and, them not being a little too effective. I want you to touch base on if there are other methods to hold our elective candidates accountable, or probably any level of government accountable for that matter. Because, maybe my knowledge would be a little too less, but your experience does matter on that. Some alternatives, it's not social audits, yeah.
Okay, let's take one more and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
And there's one more question to Smitha.
Yeah.
Smitha, can you talk a little on proactive disclosure of information being, a guide towards finding these problems among, problems among the citizens? What is the problem? So if the government discloses the information, for example, the DPT transfers happening, or for that matter, any grievance being redressed, is that if we share it effectively with the citizens over portals or digital mechanism, can that also be contributing to the adaptive learning that you were talking about? And if there's a best case across the developing countries, that for that matter?
Thank you. And over here now. Yeah.
I agree with Professor Singh that democracies are not in a position to deliver. However, I slightly disagree and like to make a point that after 75 years in India, people have become their expectations are very, very high, and MLAs, MPs and Sarpanchs are under tremendous pressure to perform. And wherever there has been left-oriented governments in West Bengal, Kerala, the reforms for the poor people have been slightly better. And I go with optimism of Professor that the Dean, that now after 75 years, the world has arrived and we are going to have better facilities and services for the citizens. And I go with Professor Smitha that studying about impact is much more important than making policies.
Any other question before I turn to the panel? Yes, Shivani?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, firstly, very informative session so far. So my question is to the entirety of the panel. So when you look at metrics to measure how accountable a democracy is or how well that democracy is performing, how do these metrics change when you move from a developing country to an underdeveloped country to a developed country? And from a public policy perspective, what as a consultant can you do to kind of model around the differences in these three categories? That's my question.
On measuring impact. Okay, so let's get some reactions from the panel now. So let me start with Smitha.
Okay, I'll start. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. But I'll take the last part of your question. There is no concept of best practice or a recipe in social impact sector. So I think that, to say that, practices, good practices, good initiatives may have worked in a particular country, in a particular situation, and trying to see that, it worked there, so it should work now in my context, etc. It does not work. So every situation needs to be done differently, and the context really, really matters. In terms of your questions around, what the government should be in terms of informing disclosures, or, as an example in DBT, as the gentleman said here, the focus of the government, in our view, should be about saying that have we been able to improve the outcome? So if it's a DBT transfer, it's not about saying that, okay, 500 rupees every 3 months, was it actually transferred? Did it actually receive? It's more about saying that how did it actually improve the outcome of the life of that person? I mean, what was that 500 rupee actually spent on? And if that was not given, what kind of issues or challenges would that citizen would have faced? So I think it's the outcome is what then becomes very, very important to track. And I think somebody asked a question on metrics, which is why we don't believe that metrics is the right way to measure an outcome. It's actually a journey towards that outcome, to say that, okay, I can build 10 schools and 1,000 schools and get X number of students admitted, but is the learning outcome coming around? Can the child read the English and maths from a foundational perspective? That's the outcome that we want to measure. And to that extent, one of the other initiatives that CPI has taken when we started was to actually build a different mechanism of even measuring impact. Because currently the norm of measuring impact is about X million lives, 100 cities, very, very numerical, and which is what Professor Naresh was saying, that those can be almost gamed by public servants or anybody for that matter to prove that they have actually done the work. And this is not just for the public servants, even for most non-profits. When they report to the donors, they said that yeah, we've actually sort of used your money well, because we spent it, and it touched X million lives, and and Y million children or whatever. So I think so we are also trying to build a different approach on impact measurement, which is what we call as a public impact framework, where the idea is actually to measure the real outcome of what the intention was, and finding ways to be able to sort of measure in that sense, both through financial metrics. I mean, we don't have better words as yet in terms of how to sort of do, assess impact. But yes, these are different frameworks and methodologies that we have been sort of working towards in supporting governments and change makers who work with the governments to see if there's real impact on the ground.
Right. I'll just add to that question before I come. If Sumalatha wants to make any comment, I'll come to you in a minute. But the shift from measuring outputs and outcomes is what we are talking about, which is the traditional way that we've been doing it all over the world, in developing as well as developed countries. But how do you measure system health? How do you measure the increase in trust between the public servant and the citizen? How do you measure, for example, learning capacity? Has the capacity to learn, have we figured out how to learn? In other words, learning to learn is also a measure. So these so-called measures are shifting very drastically, because even in the public service in Canada, which for several years has been voted the best public service in the world, where I had the privilege to serve, we measure these same things, and I know as a Director General that we can game it. We can set things up for what we can deliver on, rather than what the citizens really need. So we are shifting. We are arguing for that kind of shift. So Malathi, quick reaction before we come to Dean Sudarshan.
I'd like to answer the question on the metric of achievement. See, from the interview, it can be perceived that the Indian officials, they accept that there is an inherent problem in the system, like hierarchy, red tapeism, and even emphasis on the rules. So they are looking for a mindset change. When I ask for what suggestion do you like to make, they say they are looking for a mindset change. What they mean by mindset change, to quote one of the officials, he said he wants the systems to emphasize on the right-based approach, so that it will empower the citizens. For example, right to information, right to work, right to work. So, if right-based approach is there, it will provide accountability, and it will also improve on the effectiveness of the system. And another official said that at present the structure is emphasizing on the system. It is system-centric. So he suggests that it is better that we move from system-centric to individual-centric, so that the outcome will be like empowerment of the citizens, so that we don't want to emphasize on the outcome will be a natural process. So this is what, I observed from the interview.
Okay. So,
Well,
Mr. Sudarshan?
Yeah, what was I going to say? Just before
The social audit question?
the social audit was a vast improvement over other forms of, measuring or that we've had. It's because bureaucrats' administrative data is very unreliable because it is corrupted. People want to present a rosy picture. So by involving civil society actors and doing a social audit, you got closer to what is the reality. That's fine. But that is still being used to hold somebody responsible for success or failure. It's not being used to learn. That's my point. And we don't learn. The Auditor General presents a report on the government. That report is stable during the Parliament session, the budget session, where all the attention is on the budget and very little discussion of the CAG report. There's a lot to be learnt from even the conventional audit. So measurement is important, but what are you using the measurement for is the point. If you use the measurement to attack the allocation of coal blocks and bring a case to the Supreme Court, that's one thing. That's the accountability part, and you may be getting it right, and in this case they didn't get it right. Nonetheless, but learning is the point. Now I just wanted to say with respect to the last point you made about lower order functionaries, when M.G. Ramachandran became Chief Minister for the first time in Tamil Nadu, he made two promises to the electorate. One, I will replace all hand-pulled rickshaws with cycle rickshaws. He had a film called Rickshaw Karan, which was part of his popularity. That was easily done. Anybody brought, and the hand-pulled rickshaw is offensive to human dignity. You make a person a beast of burden. So they replaced all the hand-pulled rickshaws with cycle rickshaws, easily done. Incidentally, the West Bengal government didn't do it for a very, very long time, saying Kolkata's streets are so narrow that only a hand-pulled cart can be used. That's another matter. The other promise was midday meals in schools. Everybody went up in arms. The civil servants said impossible, teachers said impossible, can't be done, we can't convert. Already there is hardly any space. We are using, we don't have enough classrooms, and you want midday meal. So M.G. Ramachandran said, all right, I am not going to sign a single piece of paper, no authorization for any expenditure in this state until you guys who are all smart and intelligent can come up with a way by which I can deliver my promise to the people. Right? That worked. Because in every little district, in every little school, public school, village, they figured out a way. Now, it's not the same thing, but the people who had to execute the policy are the ones who figured out how to implement the policy. So to this day, Tamil Nadu's midday meal scheme works. If the Supreme Court directs the government of Bihar and says to the Chief Secretary, I will hold you, in contempt of court if you don't introduce a midday meal scheme in Bihar and in UP, you do it top down, you get poisoning, you get all sorts of problems, it doesn't work as well. Why? It's because the people who are to implement the policy were not involved in the design and the framing of the policy. So there are some lessons to learn, and we can go forward learning those lessons. So the thing is, you've got to take a mind attitude that you've got to say, I am interpreting what I know as what I do not know all the time.
So let's see if there is one more, yes. And then we will take a final half-minute comment from the panelists. I'll wrap it up. But I know you're all hungry, and we wouldn't keep you from lunch.
Yeah, so
Please, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, you can hear me, sir. So one IAS officer called Varun Agarwal said that, a district collector is like Dhoni with 7 to 8 players, few from Zimbabwe, few from Bermuda, non-performing teams. The employees down there are under, the whole system is underemployed and they're overworked. So they are already multitasking. The teachers go to conduct elections, the Anganwadi go to, workers go to political meetings. And what do you have to say about that, sir?
Anybody wants to react? Anybody knows about cricket? He's asking a question about cricket.
He's explaining a complexity.
Right.
A district collector could well say that, the job is like, it's like you have a lot of people under you, but no one is listening. It's like being in a cemetery. There are a lot of people under you, no one's listening, right?
Right.
So
well, let me just take and I will come back and answer your question when I wrap up. Please, just 30 seconds. Final comment.
I think from a final comments perspective, I think learning as a management strategy is something that I would leave the audience with. I think that's fundamental to getting better public management systems, because you can't deliver real outcomes to people's lives. It has to be a process and a chance and all that.
Thank you. Sumalatha, final.
So I believe that there is a perspective change both from the official sides and from the citizen side, which is moving towards a positive perspective towards a public service delivery system. So a little bit principles like learning, feedback, transparency can be added to the public service delivery system. I think we can be more efficient and we can achieve our 2030 goals.
Your 30-second wrap-up point.
With respect to what you said, we need reforms. In Tamil, there are two words. One is called kadamai, which can be translated as duty. The other is puruppu, which is responsibility. I heard this from animal husbandry officer in Tamil Nadu. When there is an outbreak of rinderpest, he says, the animal husbandry secretary summons all of them, these veterinarians, to go to Madras for a meeting. He says, that is my kadamai. I have to do it because I have been ordered. But what is my poruppu? What is my responsibility? I should go to where the cattle are and make sure that rinderpest doesn't spread. So there's a tension created in our form of government between duty of a person and the responsibility of the person. And we must address this through reforms. Because the attitude is, if you're summoned by the secretary, you have to go. Leave the animals alone. And then you're abandoning your responsibility. So that reform still has to happen in our country. And it's possible, we can do it, The other thing I'd say is that we need to focus a bit on virtues. What are the virtues that you should have, right? And you must have, courage is a virtue that you need to be able to learn. Because you will make mistakes, you can only learn from mistakes. But then you have to have the courage to say, yes, this was a mistake, but I'm learning from it. So that if you don't have courage, you will then not do anything. If you don't do anything, you can't be in the wrong.
So I'll just bring this now up, wrap up with a 1-minute kind of summary then of some of the main points. Smitha has identified learning. We have talked about the individual citizen experience of public service as distinct from this overall public service system as such. And Sumalatha has brought that in as well. And Professor Sudarshan has put on the table a number of points from his long years of experience. Let me just say in wrapping up that we are looking at learning, we are looking at what has worked, and has reached a level that I don't think would have been achieved without the groundbreaking work that they did, using chapatis in India and using sticks in Africa under trees. I know that work, I have done stuff like that myself, and engaging with people is a whole different mindset, and that we heard coming out as well. How do you get a mindset of engagement and participation? Participation is not about you participating in my project, which is what people tend to do. They have an already designed project, you go to the field and you get buy-in. And that's not the way it works. So that has to shift. I have to say a word on complexity, which I've spent 25 years working with. The only point I have time to say about complexity is we are not talking about complicated things. Complex adaptive systems is not about complicated stuff. It's a totally different thing. It is talking about relationships. It's taking a relational view of the world rather than an individual view. So you look at the individual, to come back to the Dhoni, was it Dhoni? The cricket thing. How do you work with the individual and the relationships in your team together? If you try to work only with the individuals, the cricket captain has 11 people only. Not as complex as when you have a public service of 5 million people. And unless you understand those relationships, it doesn't work. And that's what we mean by complexity, where you understand interrelationships, feedback loops, and so on. So to conclude then, you can do some of the things you used to do and get different results, although Einstein might not agree. If the context in which you are doing it has changed, some things might not have worked in the past. The context was very different. When I look at the India as an outsider coming in, at the energy that I find in this country, at the optimism that I find in this country, compared to maybe from 50s to 70s and 80s, I think there is a whole new optimism and energy that can make what has never worked before work now. And I believe the time has come for us to go boldly forward and try to fix the way our citizens experience public service and the way our democracy delivers to the citizen. So let me thank you then very much for coming, so many of you, and spending time with us, and thank my panelists as well. Thank you very much.